everyone, and welcome to Dragons, Gazelles, and Unicorns podcast. I'm Rosemary Truman, the founder and CEO of the Center for Advancing Innovation and Ignite Social Impact. And we can get to more of that later. But I'm here to welcome Jarrod Borkat on the podcast and this webinar. He has an incredible and inspirational background with regards to building capital architecture, building partnerships, which he has done a plethora of and a myriad of, and he's extremely creative as it relates to how to identify I guess how to create agreements in a way that looks at everybody's interests, which I think that is one of his superpowers. There's more than that. And so Jarrod Borkat is the head of strategy at CareDx. CareDx is a publicly traded company working in the transplant field and also expanding their interests in other areas. And, you know, based on, by the way, some of the companies we've seen recently, and probably some of the companies in this call, there are many ways that you guys can engage together. So I want to thank you, Jarrod, for spending your time on the podcast and the webinar.
Absolutely, Rosemary, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join you and join all of these great people on the call, and really look forward to it. So,
and I've had the privilege of knowing Jarrod Borkat for years, and different strategy mechanisms across MedImmune and AstraZeneca and CareDx. So quite a bit of history there and knowledge about how strong he is in terms of what he's been able to create, and not just create, but create architectures to advance technologies and startups. So with that, Jarrod, I'd like to start with question for you, Jarrod. So Jarrod has an incredible background as it relates to doing marathons in all continents. Hopefully I said it right. And also having worked his way up from sales at the beginning to the head of strategy at CareDx, which is the largest transplant company that exists, and making things happen out of ether. So I'll hand it over to you, Jarrod.
Sure. Thanks, Rosemary. So, yeah, glad you handed it over, because if you say too many more nice things, I think we're going to have some unrealistic expectations here on the call. So, yeah, I appreciate that. Maybe just to dig into my background a little bit, just so everybody knows the perspective I come from. And, one of the things that I love about being on calls like this, and Rosemary, I'm probably going to go off script, so you feel free to reel me in here. But when I'm just looking at some of the people here that I know, and probably a lot of the people that I don't know, there's such a plethora of experience from all of us collectively. Hopefully we'll have sufficient time at the end for Q&A, and even throughout, I'd say let's make it a little bit more of a dialogue to the extent you can with so many people on. But I think one of the great things about working with smart people is being able to leverage the collective experience. So if you either hear a perspective of mine and you've handled it differently and it's been effective, please speak up and share that, as long as that's okay with you, Rosemary.
Absolutely. A dialogue is perfect.
Okay, great. So a little bit about my background. So I work at CareDx. I actually see a few colleagues from CareDx on the line here. We are a company that focuses exclusively on patients who have had transplants. So for example, if you've had a liver or heart or kidney transplant or lung transplant, those are the kind of patients we serve with a diagnostic test that basically helps them identify if their organ is being rejected. So that's the essence of what my current company does. And I've been here for about 1.5 years now. And prior to coming to CareDx, I actually did start off in sales. I was a pharmaceutical sales rep at Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals. And I have kind of an interesting background. So for everyone who's in the life sciences industry, if you just think about the discovery, drug development, continuum, commercialization, I sort of started at the very end of that process as a sales rep. And then over the next probably 20-ish years, slowly started working my way backwards more toward the discovery side of the business. So after starting off as a pharmaceutical sales rep, being on the front lines, knowing what it was like to be in there talking to doctors on a day-to-day basis, I then went into marketing. And that was a really great experience for me. Number one, it's where I had my heart set on after becoming a sales rep, but it really allowed me to take that sales experience I had and then bring it more toward the strategy side and providing the right strategies, the right content to the right target audiences. And then after that, I had a chance to get into a portfolio role, which it was portfolio management and strategy, which largely focused on sort of late clinical development, phase 2, phase 3. That's when I moved to AstraZeneca and MedImmune about a decade into my career. And then after that, sort of worked my way backwards a little bit further into some of the earlier stage research. And that's where I took on a role for about 5 years, leading government, university, and NGO or foundation strategic partnerships. So did that for a couple of years, then moved into the traditional BD&L role of, I focused a lot of that time on out-licensing technologies for AstraZeneca MedImmune. And then after that, I took on a role at Emergent BioSolutions. So I see at least one person on the call from Emergent, another great company that focuses on providing pandemic preparedness with vaccines and other technologies. So in the event of outbreaks of anthrax, botulism, things like that, they stand ready to protect and serve Americans. So after that, so head of corporate strategy there for a couple of years. Another wonderful experience, got to work with some great people, and then moved to CareDx about 1.5 years ago. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a snapshot on the interesting fact story, which actually prior to the pandemic, I never shared this with anybody, but because it was a background of my home office and everybody asked me what it meant and what those pictures were of, if you had seen that background, it was all 7 continents, hand painted by a local artist. And in each of the 7 continents, there was a little gold dot. And it was a gift that my wife gave me for one of my birthdays to show where I had run a 10K, sorry, not a 10K, where I had run a marathon on every continent. So that was something I did with my father. And we were the first father-son duo to run a marathon on every continent together. So that was really exciting. And kind of bringing that. After working on me for about 2 years to run a 10K in every state with her. So we have done 6 and we'll be doing 2 this weekend and 1 next weekend. So she's keeping me young and healthy. And I guess with that said, maybe Rosemary, how do you want to start the conversation?
Well, I think, Jarrod, you have a fantastic experience in working with startups. I mean, there's actually kind of a multivariate set of questions that we have here. But what is the capacity that you have worked with startups?
So really good question. I've worked with startups in a variety of ways. I have spent a little bit of time looking at their technologies. I'll just give you a couple of examples of how I've worked with them, but that's one way, looking at technology, scouting for technologies, mentoring startup companies. I've also, this was kind of interesting. We actually took a trip to Israel, many years ago at this point, probably 5-6 years ago, but we saw 42 companies, all startups, less than probably 7 to 8 people per company. We saw 42 companies, 3 days while we sat in a hotel room. Just an incredible experience, and just got to see some of the most amazing technologies. What we were looking for were technologies that basically would be a complement to our existing portfolio at MedImmune and AstraZeneca. In fact, as a result of that trip, there were some additional people that ended up working in Israel to have a closer ear to the ground, looking for future opportunities. So that was pretty exciting. And then I've also been, a pitch doctor or panelist at several conferences for startups.
All right. So Jarrod, I have also been a judge at many pitching conferences, and I think this leads us into a nice, interesting conversation about that, because there's a variety of different ways of engaging with the pitching contest. And how, what would you recommend? Okay, first of all, which ones, perhaps this is not a fair question, but which ones have you found to be the most valuable for corporates and startups? And then secondarily, what have you seen as a great format for that? And then how do you choose? I mean, there's 3 questions, actually, not. Sorry to.
All right, so all good questions, and I think you just came from a conference
I did.
that did this, so I actually want to hear your experience as well. And what
Oh,
you learned
really?
from that,
Okay, all right. Okay, well.
But I guess to answer the question, what has been successful? I guess it may not be a satisfactory answer, but I would say what's most helpful from like a large company perspective is to be at one where the technologies resonate best within the context of your portfolio. So oftentimes, depending on where you go to see these pitches, there will be a lot of technologies that are not relevant. So the key to me is trying, and I'm going to kind of turn it on its head in a second, but it's being at one where the technologies are relevant. So I think some of the typical major conferences where that occurs are good places to go. What if I turned it on its head and I said, well, from a startup's perspective, what is most useful? And this could get us into an entire conversation about, the whole search process. If you're a small company, and how do you put the best foot forward to make sure you're showing up at the right conferences and at the right places? And we can dive into that in a few minutes, but the short answer, I think, is really just doing your homework and showing up where the audience is relevant to you. Whether it's from an investor standpoint, obviously it depends on what you're looking for, but you want the people in the audience to be, highly relevant, and ultimately you're not there for fun or practice. You're there to get funding, if that's, the goal. And so I would target it very selectively based on the technology within the company.
Okay.
So I think I addressed maybe 1 or 2 of the 3 questions. So which one did I miss? And I'll try to cover that as well.
Well, I want to dive into something that you mentioned, because I have so the thing is that when you go to these, okay, by the way, audience, please feel free to adjust the way we are going, but I like it to be conversational. So if someone else has a way of going, then I'm very happy and open-minded to receive your input. But
or sorry, Rosemary, if I may, if you have something to add as well, just take it off mute and jump in.
I'm on mute.
Oh, no, I'm saying if anybody,
No.
any of the attendees.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So let me jump in. This is Gil. So I just completely agree with Jarrod and you, Rosie, the point that you want to do your homework and go to conferences where the people there are going to be relevant to you. And here's the perspective I have. If a company like MedImmune, AstraZeneca, if you pitch them for something that they have never discussed with the street, they're not going to have any interest in it, because they have told the street, here's our focus, here's our strategy. And for them to go outside of that now would be very problematic. So if you have something that dovetails or is accretive to what they're doing, the programs that they're working on, that's the reason why I think, Jarrod, to your point, you want to go where things are relevant, because they're a large pharma partner, or any partner for that matter, is not going to go outside of the communications that they've had with the street. That makes sense.
Yeah, Gil, that is such a good point. And maybe just to elaborate on it a little bit more, there's kind of two ways you can get at what is of interest to the companies. You can go on their website, and sometimes the companies will show specifically what technologies they're interested in. But then the part you may not necessarily get from that, which you would get from either listening to investor presentations or just reading some of their filings and just being really thoughtful from a science to new areas. Because what a lot of companies do is they'll look at adjacencies to try to think about how can they leverage their capabilities, their skill sets, and where can they evolve slightly from there. And the more you can understand about that, and the more you can understand how your technology fits within that context, the more successfully you can identify companies to pursue.
Completely agree.
Okay, so I have a few things to add, if you don't mind, Jarrod.
No, please go for it.
So a few things that, so my specialty background is in growth strategy. So we think about growth strategy in terms of Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and Horizon 3. Horizon 1 being like tactical things that you need, any startup needs to do, advertising, making sure that you have the right touch points, which is what we're talking about with the conferences. But there are 11 to 13 levers for each industry segment. So they are foundational table stakes things. Horizon 2 are the adjacencies that Jarrod mentioned, which are companies are looking to expand their current portfolio. And by the way, I have Jarrod, I have a few that from my last couple of days for you. And those are, they're just taking your current portfolio. Let's say you have this lipstick. You need a case for the lipstick. And I do have lipstick on my desk. But the case then is at an adjacency because it's something that is not really outside your realm. And Horizon 3 are your growth breakthroughs that are things that don't exist yet, that could truly create breakthroughs for you. And that's my favorite area, by the way. These are things that, like I said, don't exist yet, but most of the time there are some bundle of technologies you can use to allow the company to do have a pillar at least to go into another industry. The other thing is on the engagement with people at conferences and trying to strategically identify which conferences you should go to, that the data is not evident for a lot of companies, meaning the conference says, okay, these are the people we're targeting. They have like a list, and then, but you don't really have the complete transparency to perform your due diligence. And so I don't know if you have any tricks for that, Jarrod.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think it's, when I think about the whole search process, how do you identify the companies and you don't have all the information? Maybe it's worth talking about like what are some of the tricks in how you identify companies? How do you understand their strategies? I think for the Horizon 3, that's probably a pretty difficult, or like one of the more difficult areas if you're a startup company and you're trying to approach someone's Horizon 3, because that is longer term. It's harder to define. And
harder to sell.
The likelihood is the companies are actually yes, absolutely. And the likelihood is that they're actually trying to, focus on the Horizon 1 or maybe the Horizon 2. And so then it kind of comes down to the question of, well, how do you know what they are, and how can you analyze them in the right way? So maybe think about, other than the two ways that I've already talked about information. So one is through networks. And I think a lot of us probably, are familiar with getting deal flow through networks and trying to figure out what companies we should approach. But I had kind of an interesting experience happen to me years ago that was actually invaluable. But it also made me think back to a book I read about Warren Buffett and how he started his career. And if you look at what made him successful, other than kind of all of his personality traits, his his intelligence, et cetera, one of the things he did was he really understood the companies that he invested in. He wanted to talk to the management teams. He wanted to get to know the company in, backwards and forwards. And that allowed him to make some really good decisions. So the experience I had a couple of years ago was, and there's at least one person on this call who was a part of this, but we identified all the local companies in our region. And we sort of went through and we said, okay, which were we actually created a list of the ones that we thought were the most promising. And then we watched them for a couple of years. And I was amazed at how well we did. And when I thought back to how did we know those were going to be more successful companies? A lot of them, either went public or raised a Series A, B, or C. And in reflecting back on it, it wasn't because we were smarter than anybody else. I think it was because we really had our ears to the ground in a community and we were talking to a lot of people. So we knew what the companies were interested in. We knew what they were developing. We had an idea of that next phase of growth. And I think, and we had a,
You would like to?
we basically had kind of that firsthand experience that you can't just get from their website. So that was something that I thought with the Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3 are. That's another good way to augment it, is through that sort of first ground level experience in talking to people and getting to know people. As I think about some of the other ways to search and how do you do an effective job of targeting, associations can be a good council. You'll get to meet a lot of the companies, you'll get to hear some of them, you'll get to see who's winning awards. And while you're doing this, you're trying to link them to what you need to advance your own technology, whether that's from a partnership perspective, seeking investors, scientific partnerships, et cetera. So networking events, having a really good idea of who the competitors are, looking at the competitive pipelines, I think gives you see who they're talking to the extent you can. Technology mapping, which is basically looking at universities, governments, nonprofits, and other companies. Like if you ask everyone on the call for whatever technology you're working on, could you show on a sheet of paper everyone who's working in this field, and to the extent that the information is publicly available or through databases, can you show who is most relevant to you? And I think if you do that, it gives you a really good understanding of how the science is evolving and where specifically you can play and with whom.
Mm-hmm. I agree, Jarrod. I want to comment on your point about networking, because I had I used to be the head of the Founder Institute's DMV area to launch companies around here. So we launched approximately 30 companies the first year, 24 the second year, and I think 14 the third year. And what's interesting is we in the Center for Advancing Innovation, I'm the founder and CEO of that company, but we're also the founder and CEO of Ignite Social Impact, which is another company that's for profit that allows companies to come onto the platform to launch $5 million. The only reason I mention that is because I abandoned the Founder Institute because it was the time-consuming nature. But the new guy, who is the head of the Founder Institute, had lunch with today. And you think about your Venn diagrams, and there's only a little bit of overlap. And so he's got a lot of networking that we don't have. And then we have a lot of networking he doesn't have. And then I think about Tian Wong, we all know Tian Wong. And so we have all these Venn diagrams. And if we could collaborate together and create a more holistic picture of what the networks that could be of interest, that could really advance the ability to scale your company.
It means when you go into that room or when you go into that negotiation, know who you're talking to.
Yes.
Know what your backup plan is. Know the different ways in which the conversation can go left or right, and how you might adjust to that. So the other thing that's really important to know is, and I've actually even seen this over the last a couple of conversations I've had at my current company, is really listen carefully for what people are saying. And the more experienced they are, sometimes they will be extremely direct, and that's really helpful. But oftentimes, if you just listen to what they say and the way they say it, they might actually be saying no without telling you no. But you can hear it in, a way they express their viewpoint, for example. So in those situations, when you're in a room like that, I always try to understand, how do people think about the situation? What's their motivation? And when you better understand that, you can kind of tackle some of the issues in a much more effective way, in my opinion. So maybe just as an example, if you're talking about that situation you were talking about, Sarah, when you understand the motivations of, like, let's say, economic development people and professionals, they have a certain incentive and they do their jobs. And, a lot of the people we work with were absolutely incredible. But they had their individual kind of motivations based on who they were working for, what they were trying to achieve. And when, I introduced people in that context, I tried to understand what everyone wanted to be successful, what they needed out of the deal or the outcome, and try to think about how can you pull those together in such a way that ultimately both people can walk away looking good. And yes, are there a lot of difficult conversations in the process of that? Absolutely. I'll give you a real world example where I won't mention the university that I was partnering with, but there was a point at which in the discussions we talking for about a month. And at the end of the day, we actually both came out looking really good. And it was a very strong partnership and it lasted for a long time. But, I couldn't look good in the context of the structure of and I think the university, they weren't happy with how the structure was looking at that moment. So we had to take a little bit of a cooling off period, if you will. But in the end, it all worked out. The relationships were all maintained and last to this day. So hopefully that's a little bit of helpful context in really reading a room and understanding motivations and how to get people talking along the same lines.
So Jarrod, that brings me to a couple more questions. And by the way, if anyone has a question they want to interject with, I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Rosemary, it's Al Karim from Emergent. Really great that you're organizing this and having Jarrod here. I just wanted to piggyback a little bit about the sort of the behavior in the partnership room, so to speak. And I've often found, when I've met people for the first time, let's say you haven't had much traction with them and you're meeting them for the first time, the conversations around collaborations and partnerships that have been more successful in my mind is when everyone around the table is of the same sort of body language. When I felt in rooms where I've seen people, kind of being overbearing and trying to kind of talk down, rather than having a growth mindset or an open mindset and saying, you know what, we want to partner with you. Here's how we'd like to do it. This is our thinking. This is our initial thinking, but we're kind of still open to different ways of working with you guys. Then I find that it opens up so many more sort of, doors for you to think about. Sometimes, as Jarrod has mentioned, it's like the most sort of mainstream ways of working together may not be the right ones, only because of company life cycles and budgets and other sensitivities that are going on there, but it may be that it's those little ones that actually help you to connect and have that traction. And those are the ones that last the longest, and you're able to then branch off of that. So sometimes I find potential partners, when they come to the table, they're looking for the world, because it means a lot to them, as Jarrod is saying, their motivation is really to become successful and grow really quickly. But at times, I think you have to kind of be careful about how you approach that partnership, because I find in some cases, smaller steps have actually resulted in a much larger, return on investment.
Al Karim, that's such a good point. And you almost have to try to understand to the extent they'll share it with you. Is like, if you're the small company and you're talking to big pharma, for example, like how does what we're talking about company's current priorities? And one of the frustrations I've heard from small companies is, oh, we were hot and heavy. We were talking, every day or every week for a couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden now the BD person at the company is no longer talking to me. What's going on? And the reality is it could be a myriad of factors. It could be because their budgets just got cut. It could be because they're talking about a shift in strategy. It could be simply that the person has been, distracted by another deal because a different deal all of a sudden advanced to the next phase. So I would be cautious in reading into that. But to your point, like get those little wins and really try to understand what does this mean to the other party? What do they want out of it? How can they win and be successful with this?
And I would add, Jarrod, that sometimes the entire top deck has shifted, and there's like, we worked, or I personally worked with a lot of board of directors across 50 to Fortune 100s, and I only say that because there's a constant movement going on, and there's some kind of strenuous conversations happening at the top level that start to filter down, but they're not there yet. So sometimes the decision making can't go forward yet. I mean, that's my personal experience. But
yeah, I think that's right. And I'll give you another example of something I've seen in the last couple of years on a specific deal where I'll just talk about like of it. But it's a very experienced BD professional, but for whatever reason, in the communication back and forth, largely by email, there were like 1 to 2 points that were not clearly conveyed for some reason. And the BD person was ready to write it off and actually sent an email back saying, hey, thank you, but we're not interested. And it turns out that with a little bit of encouragement from the small company saying like, hey, we really should talk about this. They ended up coming back together, and then it actually became a relevant. So sometimes it could be something that simple. So that's where I think strong communication can be really valuable.
I can't agree more, Jarrod. I mean, no is not no. The thing is to be tenacious, and then also make sure that you communicate in another way. And again, go back to your value proposition that you mentioned, that becoming aware of what could make them. I mean, this is something that you're brilliant at, Jarrod. I mean, just identifying the points of views from each party and then aligning them to make sure the deals happen. Okay, well, I said it for you, so you didn't. I said it 3 times.
Oh, thank you. You are too kind. The other thing to think about is, and I'm sure probably a lot of people already know this, but it's a really important point, I think, is it's typically not the BD individual who is the champion for doing the deal. So what's really helpful to know is who is the champion, or who should the champion be, and how do I try to creatively get to that individual? The answer to that question might be it's their head of research. And maybe you should try to find out who that person is and see if maybe you can connect with him. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but it's fine, Jarrod.
Okay. So yeah, really trying to understand who that champion is, because I think sometimes people who are this company they're trying to start. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So sometimes the BD professional, or, the person working with the BD professional from the small company, if it's someone who, maybe it's their first company, they haven't done a lot of deals, they may not realize that it's usually someone at a fairly senior level, or maybe the head of R&D or the head of R&D for a therapeutic area is the person who is ultimately driving the decision or being that champion for the deal. So the question is, how can you make sure that you've told your story in a compelling way to that individual?
So Jarrod, though, this is like a multi-tier issue. So let's say that the person you're pitching to is having a bad day. They don't really hear everything you're saying. Sometimes I know circumvention is not something that I would suggest all the time, but would you recommend multiple touch points?
Well, there's a fine balance to that, because if you go around your BD person, that will not engender goodwill. That's the short answer.
Yeah.
But can you go to a conference and coincidentally run into someone in the organization and have a conversation with them? Yes, and that does happen. Obviously, the more formal structure of setting up time when you're at bio or whatever the conference is that's relevant is a really good way to do it. But I think that my point is trying to be creative, and more importantly is really understanding, like, how did the decisions get made? And usually, or a lot of times, people won't just come right out and tell you the answer to that. But I think through conversation, you can ask, and hopefully they'll give you some insight, but you can absolutely ask. And I think it's a good practice to say, how does the decision-making work on your end? How does the BD process work?
Incredible insights, Jarrod.
I spent 2 years of my career in Germany, and the communication style there, absolutely different. It was much more of a very direct communication style. And I'll never forget the first board meeting I came back to, the senior executive meeting in the US. And the very first one was the language that was used in that meeting from our executives was what I'm going to call very flowery compared to what I had been accustomed to for the prior 2 years while being in Germany. So it was just, you're right, there's sort of a little bit of a dance in the American culture. But I would probably emphasize that should, and I'll use your word sleazy, Renee, just because I liked it. But it should never, like, honesty and integrity, I think, is absolutely critical in any deal.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you're disclosing 100% of information, but to me, the true testament of being good in a deal, if you can get everything that you wanted and you feel like you've won. This was actually one of my last licensing deals when I was at AstraZeneca and MedImmune. I actually left right after that, but the person I was negotiating with called me up and said he wanted me to come work for him and actually help start that company. But yet I got everything we needed. He felt like he won. My company was very happy about it. It was the best thing for the technology to grow because it wasn't going to grow like that within our own walls. So I think there's how you do it in the American style and still preserve your integrity and honesty, I think is absolutely critical.
And then we have only 1 minute left. So Jarrod, you can wrap up. I have like lots of notes I could wrap up with, but it also depends on, who you are in that country. So for example, I was running a project all around the world. I ran the first cloud computing platform for Oracle around the world. When we got to Japan, they called me the white devil because I'm the white girl who I'm not running the project. I don't know how to use chopsticks, So there are lots of cultural elements that are nuances that, I had already done the deal. So because I did the deal in the UK with it was, a big, the largest conglomerate in all of Europe and Asia, actually. But the thing is that they do buy the person and they will back the person. When you do a deal, they back the person. But there's also, you still have to get everything done. So that's somewhat interesting when you're looking at the cultural diversities and dynamics as you enter. So it's not just like one dimensional. It's like there's I was thinking about it one night. I think there was about more than X, Y, and Z, a lot more
Yeah.
that you have to think about. But the main thing is getting the deal done. But Jarrod, do you want to, I know it's 4 o'clock right now and you're going for a plane, so I don't want to keep you, but are there any last points that you want to make? I mean, you've given us a lot of wisdom and very, very valuable insights that for. And by the way, I think we should do another podcast because there's about 10 other things that I think would be great to speak about.
Yeah, maybe just one or two things that I didn't get a chance to say, and then we'll wrap up here. But one is, you know, as you're working with attorneys and looking at the contracts, I would encourage everyone. I mean, anyone who has not a lot of experience in this area, make sure you read every line in the contract and make sure you understand what it is you're signing up for, because we didn't talk about alliance management or what happens after the deal, but it's critically important. And one little sentence can cost millions and millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, I think the word will versus shall, for example, can cost a lot of money. There have been some cases on that. And the, you know, make sure you're getting good outside legal counsel, tap into your network of people you know for advice. You know, surround yourself with really bright people who want to help without expecting anything in return. That's always been, you know, my motto is I'll give what I can and expect nothing in return. And somehow that will make all of us more effective at what we do. So that legal aspect was something I wanted to highlight. And then the last thing is maybe look for programs in your area that you can get mentorship. So for example, there was a model that was employed by the Tech Council of Maryland that was borrowed from MIT, and it was a wildly successful program where they connected experienced professionals with startup companies. And the purpose of it was basically to help promising technologies flourish. So great program. There may be things like that that you have access to. And then Rosemary, I'm sure you have lots of programs on funding, but how to access government funding would be another thing to consider. It's good to have non-dilutive funding, which you can get from the government. You can also get it from local technology, like economic development authorities. If you have a promising company and you're going to grow it to 50 people in the next year, 2 years, they might give you a couple of $100,000 for non-dilutive funding to set up shop in their area. So don't hesitate to look into that as well. So maybe a couple of points I didn't get a chance to highlight earlier that hopefully are useful. And Rosemary, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you everyone for joining today, and happy Friday and have a great weekend.